Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at one of our HTML elements. In this particular video, we're going to look at the nav or navigation element. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on what I'm calling intermediate HTML. In other words, this is the stuff that isn't necessarily required for a very basic web page, but starts to invoke a little bit of sophistication. And again, this video out of context is going to seem a little strange, so I encourage you to go back and watch some of the earlier videos. But this video is one of several semantic elements that we're going to focus on. And again, what are semantic elements? They sort of have an implied meaning in the name of the tag or the name of the element. In this case, as you can imagine, the nav element or nav tag is intended to help you navigate your website. Now, before we get started, we want to make a quick mention that you want to be careful about using the nav tag. In other words, you don't want to clutter it with too much information. The idea is that it would just basically provide the user with a easy way to navigate through some of the major elements or the major pages in your website. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of example pages to be able to demonstrate this navigation ability. And before we start with that, we want to take a look at the basic syntax. So again, much like with the other elements, we have an open and close tag. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bury inside of the nav tag a bunch of A tags. And those are for hyperlinks. You could technically put other types of tags in there, but primarily the idea is that you would have an A tag or a navigation tag, href tag, a hyperlink tag inside of your navigation tag. And then what we're going to do is we're going to link several of our existing pages together. Now, I've cheated a little bit just to keep this video fairly short. That I've created a couple of HTML pages for us. If you don't already have some of them from one of your earlier projects or earlier assignment, then I encourage you to take a second to go back and actually create them. And what I have here is a home, a rather weirdly named home because we're going to do this one a couple of different ways, but a home underscore o1.html, an examples underscore o1.html. This is intended to be sort of an aggregation page for all of your earlier examples. And then an about underscore o1 HTML. Again, this is probably where you'd put your contact information, maybe a nice professional headshot, etc. Now, obviously, I don't have all of that here because I'm just focusing on the structure. I'm wanting to keep this as simple as possible so we don't lose track of what we're actually trying to do. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back over to the home. We'll start here. And then what you want to do is you want to introduce our nav tag. And again, our open and close tag. And as I mentioned earlier, you technically have a lot of options here as far as the nested elements that you can put inside of a nav tag. The most common one, of course, is just simply to go ahead and put in your A tag and then follow this up with an href. Now, hopefully you've watched the earlier video on how to hyperlink documents together or resources together, whether it was another page, as I showed in an earlier video, or maybe an image, or perhaps even another site. We can play around with these however we want to. But we'll start with keeping it simple. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and use a local reference. In other words, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the local resources that sits in the same folder. Again, in an earlier video, I talked about where you could place your resources in subfolders and things along those lines. Excuse me. But in this case, I have all of my files all in one location. And so what I want to do is in the navigation element on my homepage, I'm going to actually include a mention of my home.html. And it seems a little strange. In other words, why in the world would you put your home HTML hyperlink on your homepage? Well, in other words, it is a sort of a simple way for you to get back to the homepage if you've scrolled around inside of it. And again, our navigation bar is going to be at the top of the page. So this particular one's not going to be terribly useful, but part of the reason I'm doing it this way is that we have consistency, and then we simply give it a friendly name. We'll just leave it at home to keep it consistent. And then we can, of course, much like with the other attributes in the A tag, we can we can decide whether we want it to open in the same page into a new browser tab or whatnot. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow this up now with another href, a href. And I'm going to just go through, I'm going to do our examples _1 in the, if you've been following along, you just noticed that I made a mistake, which we'll go ahead and correct. It's supposed to be home _1. Obviously, if you were doing this in production, you might not have a home _1. You probably just call it home. But we're going to follow this up with another example in just a minute. And we're going to go ahead and have examples. And then lastly, then what I want to have is another href. And I'm going to have my about _1.html. And again, I simply have all of these sitting in the same folder. We can use subfolders. We'll add one in just a second, an additional one in just a second here. But I'm just going to call this one about. And I think we've got this kind of working here. So we're going to go ahead and save it. We'll go out to our favorite web browser and we're going to launch our homepage. And again, not very interesting. I'll zoom in here a little bit. Looks decent. It's not terrible. Again, remember, we aren't worried about styling here. We're mainly focusing on the structure, the functionality, if you would, not the behavior, not the functionality of what happens when you click on something in your web page. We'll talk about that later on when we look at JavaScript. In other words, we're just using the native functionality of HTML. And so if we click here on home, it of course takes us back to home, and we click on examples and it takes us to our examples page. And right now we're stuck with going back, which again is not bad. We'll make some improvements there, but we click on our about and sure enough, it goes to our about page and we can go back. Now, obviously, if we can do this with one page, well, we can probably go ahead and do it with others. And so what we're going to do is we're going to very carefully copy our navigation elements into the body of our examples and also into the about page. And if you think about it real quick, you probably already saw where this could be problematic if you were responsible for hosting hundreds of pages and someone comes along and wants to make a change. So we'll come back to different options of how to handle that in later videos. But for right now, we're going to assume that this is a manual process, slightly annoying, but a manual process. And again, you can see that if you make one change on one page to one of the links, you just need to remember to change it on all of the pages. So again, not the worst problem in the world to have. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. I can now select home just like before, and it would take me back to my home page. Difference, of course, now is I can select examples, and sure enough, now I can go to the examples page, but now I have my home page here. And I can also go about, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit and go to home, or I can go to examples and back and forth. You get the general idea here. Now, what I'd like to do is demonstrate that you aren't restricted to simply going to pages that are on your local resource. You can, for instance, just throw in another hyperlink, and I'm just going to do this perhaps on my home page here. And that what I can do here is either a href. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in www.uab.edu and put in UAB. And again, I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I think you can sort of start to see all of the different possibilities. Of course, if I go back to my home page now, I have UAB here, but I don't have it on any of the other pages, which again, may not be the worst thing in the world. You just have to keep that in mind. But sure enough, if I click on that, what did I do? I think I forgot the protocol in front of it. Yes, I did. That was my fault. So let's go back here one more time. So one of the reasons I like doing these videos in one shot is because you guys get to see some of the common mistakes. I don't want to hide them from you. There we go. Let's go ahead and include that. And then now let's come back here to our web browser, refresh it. And if we go to there, we should go to UAB's website. So yes, common mistake. To forget when you're going to an external resource, to another web page, that you do need to go ahead and put in the protocol in front of it, especially when you're going to an HTTPS site. So before I leave you with this video. I want to go back one more time to our resources, and perhaps this part of the video won't age terribly well because, again, these platforms change their format, but I did want to sort of use this as an excuse to sort of poke around, do a little exploration to sort of understand how some of these major sites would use these nav elements. And so what I did was I started poking around, and I looked up here and I thought, well, there's a lot of options up here. So what I did is I just went ahead and right clicked and I went to inspect, and I noticed that, again, they are using, of course, the ahref, but they've got this wrapped then in the div tags. And if you notice, if I go slowly up here, eventually that entire bar gets highlighted. And so just like what we talked about when we were looking at the footers, there's a couple of different ways that you can do certain things. And in this case, the W3 schools decided that this particular aspect of their page they were again going to handle through a div tag and a combination of hyperlinks. My guess is they probably just did that for styling reasons, although there is some functionality difference in this particular case. Lots of reasons that you would go about doing that. But I thought, let me look a little further. And again, you can guess by just simply right-clicking on the elements and sort of guessing or poking around. But I thought I'd show you, or rather use this opportunity to show you another little trick or another little tool in your disposal, or perhaps just remind you of another tool in your arsenal here. And that what we're going to do is we're going to select Control U or look at the page source. And then this is all of the HTML for that particular page. And there's, as you can imagine, a lot of it. And then what I did is I simply did Control F, and I am now looking for the open angle bracket NAV. Now, your first guess would be to go ahead and close that angle bracket, and you won't find anything because, as you can imagine, they're probably going to distinguish it using an ID or a class attribute. So the open angle bracket and nav will, of course, pull up something. And I thought this was interesting because it's not immediately obvious where they were using their navigation toolbar. And if you look here, digging into it a little bit, you'll see the word tutorials. And so what I did then is I went back to the page, to the rendered page, the pretty stuff. It's a little easier to see. And sure enough, you could see there's tutorials. And then I went back one more time and I scrolled down just a little further and I saw references. And well, I think you can start to see the pattern now. So apparently this portion up here, they decided to do with the nav. And then this portion here, they decided to do with the div tags. And likewise with our Wikipedia page, we can do the exact same thing. And again, I had a little bit of amusement, a little bit of curiosity here. Your first thought might be, well, this is some sort of unusual nav element. And it turns out it is in fact not. You can simply just right click and go to inspect. And you can see that it is, again, sort of a combination, in this case, of list elements, div tags, all sorts of different possibilities that you could employ here. And you could dig into it and you can figure out, my browser is rendering a little weird because of the width, but I've hidden some of the menu here. But instead, what I want to do is I want to close the inspect for just a second. And I, again, want to do Control U, or you can simply just right click and go to View Page Source, whichever you'd like to do. And again, I'm going to employ the same trick, and I'm going to use the angle bracket and the nav. And sure enough, if you start digging into it, you'll start seeing that they too used the nav element in different aspects of their page. And then again, I had to sort of dig into it a little bit to figure out, all right, well, here's the main menu. Where is main menu actually represented on the page? Where is navigation, represented on the page, and so on. Again, what you would do is you just simply go back and you'd figure out exactly where each of these elements are. And the one that I discovered that was the easiest to find was the appearance. And if you go back over here one more time to the source, you can actually find where they have the appearance. And well, I say that, and now I'm not able to easily find it. So let's cheat one more time. I'm just going to go ahead and use the search here. So there we go. Nope. There we go, right there. All right. So in other words, you could see here that they're using a whole combination of elements here. They're using a nav, a div, and what we'll talk about later on in combination with that is going to be a span. Again, some of these are semantic elements and some of these are non-semantic elements, and hoping that you're starting to sort of a bigger picture of how you would go about using some of these, not only for the structure, but then being able to sort of pull out pieces of information out of your web page. So hopefully you found this particular video useful. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.